Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the first panel for Law School and Beyond, a webinar series created to help students interested in pursuing law school and to give them insight into the law school experience, as well as networking opportunities for post-law school careers by introducing the many paths a law degree can provide. The law school application process has changed significantly since the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic, especially with the introduction of the LSAT Flex. From tips about the LSAT to firsthand accounts of the classroom experience, this first session is geared towards students who want to learn more about law school in general. Attendees will also hear from students who have taken the LSAT Flex and how it differs from the original test, as well as what law school has been like since the pandemic.
Hello, everyone. My name is Christina Bolin. I am a junior from the NYU DC campus, and I will be one of your co-moderators today. Today, we are joined with Ariane Connell, who is a third-year law student, Roxanne Roman, who is a current NYU residential life assistant, and Alec Webley, who's a commercial litigator at Kirkland & Ellis. And we're here to learn more about what the law school experience is like. So I'm going to throw the first question to Roxanne. Can you tell us a little bit about how you ended up going to law school or applying to law school?
Sure. I'm a current applicant, so I can't really speak to what it's like at law school. I will leave that to my fellow panelists. But the decision on deciding to go, I think, was a long one for me. There's a lot of folks, and I'm sure for those that are attending, you're probably the type of person that has thought about this much farther in the future than I did. I decided to work and do a master's program after I graduated from undergrad. So my journey to this decision has been a little more winding and longer sought. But all in all, it was something that I was interested very faintly in undergrad. And then having taken the opportunity to do other things in other fields, that has informed a lot about the work that I would like to do and the education that I need to get there. Which is how we ended up on the law school path. I definitely think that it's this road that I need to take to open the doors to get further in like the education field that I want to stay in.
Any other panelists want to jump in? What made you want to go to law school?
Ariane, you're there now, so.
Yeah, I can tap in. I decided to go to law school because I actually did a pre-law program back when I was in college. It was called the LSAC Plus program, and LSAC are the people who are associated with the LSAT. And through that program, I really just got a chance to see the different kind of career paths that you could really pursue with the law degree. And I really just liked how versatile it was, because at the time I didn't really know what I wanted to do yet. So just knowing that there were so many options going into it was really exciting for me. And then I ended up working for 2 years after I graduated from undergrad at a law firm, and there I was doing diversity, pro bono stuff, and working with like their training department, and that gave me just like a greater understanding of like what it would be like to work at a law firm, what it would be like to work in the law period, and so that's when I ended up applying.
And for me, I think my experience very much tracks Roxanne's, actually, in that I also did a master's program in in my case, with political science, on the road to a PhD, and came to realize, as I think many people on that road do, that the PhD wasn't necessarily the destination I wanted to ultimately reach. And this was particularly confirmed to me when my supervisor told me that my PhD research interests were too law-focused. It didn't help that my law supervisor told me my interests were too political science-focused. But law school seemed like the right fit. And I think that looking back on many decisions and interests I had, in hindsight, it was a very logical destination. I didn't have specific experience of being a lawyer. I'm the first lawyer in my family, but certainly the intellectual space of law was something that I had been persistently interested in. And so that was my road to working out that it was a good fit.
So a couple of you guys talked about like different things that you guys did to prepare for law school, like the pre-law program, but was there anything else specific that you guys did to help, I don't know, like guide you towards law school, or was there anything that like made the application process different for you?
I think one thing that was instrumental in my eventual decision to go to law school was a class I took sophomore year that was called The Relationship Between Government and Religion. And it was focused on this like very specific line in the Constitution. And it was taught by the president at the time, NYU president at the time, John Sexton. And that course sort of modeled very faintly like apparently what a course is like in actual law school. And having taken that one class was a really good sort of launch pad or buffer to somewhat understanding like what I'd be getting myself into, or like how I'd be performing and things like that later down the line. And that's one of the things that I did in undergrad to sort of help me see like what the experience could be like down the road.
Yeah, like Roxanne, I also took a class. I studied abroad in Copenhagen in undergrad, and I took a human trafficking course. And my professor was actually a lawyer at the time too. So like just hearing more about her experiences and how she was using her law degree really kind of like made me want to go to law school. But then it was also helpful like when I was in the application process in terms of having a resource and someone who I could kind of like run my application by, help in terms of like reading my essays and things like that. So I do think that networking was a huge part of it for me when I was in my job. And then also while I was still in undergrad, I reached out to like a lot of alumni who I knew had gone to law school or were in the process of doing that. And I think that that's something that's also super helpful just to kind of get firsthand kind of like knowledge from people who are actually doing it or have done it recently. So yeah, I think that that was really helpful for me.
I suppose for me, the note I'll strike is that unlike my two much better prepared co-panelists, I did virtually nothing in undergraduate to prepare for law school. In that I didn't really know that I wanted to go to law school. I had been so committed to graduate school. I had taken classes with political science professors who would just open conversations with, right now, once you get to your ABD stage, and then it was a little bit of a course correction. And so I think that the note I want to strike here is reassuring, which is that it's eminently possible to decide to go to law school and do perfectly well in the admissions process, even after you finished undergraduate. There's certainly, I think the average, at least at NYU Law, at least when I was there, the average time out of school was about 2 years for someone who was in the entering class. So that meant that most of your classmates will have really only started the application process proper after they finished undergraduate, and folks came from a huge variety of backgrounds and experiences, while also completely agreeing that taking classes in the area really, really helpful, and networking, I completely agree, is essential, especially because many schools are still looking for those recommendation letters, and different schools will put different weight on those letters. So no, absolutely.
Alec, you mentioned that, law school seemed like a right fit. And then you were saying that you did nothing to prepare, or like you had stumbled upon law school. So how do students choose to go to law school? Like, how do you know when it's the right fit?
So I have a test that I propose to other people that I think never fails. And that is, go to SCOTUS blog. That's SCOTUS blog. I suspect quite a few viewers visit it routinely already, and go to their decided cases for this year and look up something that seems only moderately interesting, not, really sexy, gays versus God, but something about, for example, there was a very important case about Ford Motor Company that came down a little while ago, which dealt with the question of whether a court in a given state, under what circumstances can they have jurisdiction over a company based in a different state. And my recommendation is go through and read SCOTUS blog's very well written, very accessible journalistic coverage of these boring cases. If you find yourself thinking, that's interesting, I want to read more, this is something I've never heard about, I'm enjoying myself, then law school is right for you. If on the other hand, you're like, oh, this is dull, horrible, hard going, the Supreme Court deals exclusively with the most interesting things in law. You will almost, the number of people that work on these most fascinatingly interesting things is vanishingly small. If the most interesting things in law aren't grabbing your attention, then I think you're going to find it really boring. And if you find it really boring, life is too short to spend 3 years and $400,000 on a course of boredom, because law school is going to be far more boring than reading and far more difficult than reading these sort of journalistic approaches. So that may not be precisely answering the question of my personal experience, but I've certainly found a lot of folks working out whether or not it's for them by sort of exposing themselves to law at its most interesting, which is still not, can be quite boring, and making their decision from there.
Ariane, did you have a similar experience trying to find your right fit? You're reading SCOTUS blogs, you're finding that even the most boring parts of law school, you're like, you know what, I can like that. Did you have a similar experience to Alec?
Well, I did not read SCOTUS blogs beforehand, but I do think that if you have any sort of interest in the law, like that can really fuel like you wanting to go. I also think, like I said, like talking to people about their experiences, I think is one of the big things for me and why I ended up going, like getting that firsthand, like what it was actually like, what were kind of like the hardest parts, the easiest parts, the things that you actually liked. Hearing about that was really helpful for me. And I mean, I honestly didn't know if I wanted to go for sure right out of undergrad, which is why I didn't go straight through. So taking those 2 years off and working at a law firm, I was really exposed to like so many different attorneys who also had friends who were doing other things as well. And so I really just think that that's the best way to really get a good sense of it as well.
How about you, Roxanne? What was your right fit moment for law school?
As someone who decided really late that I wanted to go, I think it was more of a, like you work and then you realize that there are limits to what you can do with the education that you have. And then certain paths open up, like, do you pursue the PhD? I already have a master's. So do you pursue the PhD? Do you do the JD route? And obviously this is very much tailored to different disciplines and different fields. But then you realize, like, in order to get further in the field that you want to get in, there are certain criteria that need to be had. And for me, like law school just had the most flexibility, made the most sense with my interests for being able to unlock those like future opportunities.
Okay, and Roxanne, not to put you on the spot again, but I know you're going through the application process right now. So I was just wondering what taking the LSAT was like during the pandemic and how it's been going for you so far.
I was like in that crop of people that was just about to take the LSAT, and everything turned to the LSAT Flex like almost immediately after. So I never had the chance to sit for the paper exam, or well, I guess it wasn't paper anymore, but the full like 5 section. I think the LSAT Flex has been great. I have nothing to compare it to, but it's been really nice to take it in like my own space, sort of at my own time, in like a controlled environment. I think the 3 section is, I think it depends on you and how you are as a tester. I think it can be an advantage or a disadvantage. For me, who lacks stamina, I think it was definitely an advantage, and I've done really well in the LSAT Flex. But that being said, I don't know that it's the right like platform or method for everybody, but it is something that it's definitely learnable, definitely doable. I think it's more of a mental game and like a discipline game than anything else. And it's also like a marathon, not a sprint. So I think just like preparedness and doing your research and, just making sure that you stay healthy mentally and physically is all that will help you through the process. Though I don't know if I think they might be reintroducing more sections later on now that we're deeper into like pandemic recovery period, I guess.
Yeah, and so I just posed the same question to the other panelists. What was the LSAT like for you guys? I know you took the regular one, I guess, quote unquote, regular one before the pandemic. So what was that like for you? And was it like interesting? Was it terrible? How was it?
Yeah, so when I took the LSAT, it was in the regular format. And I think so the LSAT is broken down into, I think, 3 different sections of like types of material that you could have. So I think that there's like with the SAT or ACT, whatever you took there, like there are going to be sections that you feel more strongly about, like you're better at. And then you'll obviously have like your weaker sections. So I think like in preparing for it, it was really important for me to kind of like focus in on those sections that I didn't feel as comfortable with. And so like by the end of it, I think that I did feel confident that I could, get through the full thing and get a good enough score for me to end up applying to schools. I mean, after you study, you'll like know what 35 minutes feels like. And I think that like that's a key part of it. Like Roxanne was saying, like there's a lot of stamina into it, but also like I do struggle with like time limits and all of that stuff. So I think that just like knowing yourself as like how you study, what's best method wise for you and stuff like that is just really important when you're going into the process. And then also don't take it too seriously, I would say also, because I think that some people psych themselves out with these kind of like standardized tests and stuff. So I think like remaining calm was something that really helped me. And I was like one of those people who was like, I'm taking this one time and one time only, and that's what we're doing. So I think just like knowing yourself, as I said, is just super important.
I mean, I took it many years ago at this point, where, back in our day, you had to have a backpack full of rocks. And then, they shot at you after the 3rd round if you got the logic game wrong. But I think that the trouble with giving advice on the LSAT is I feel that all the advice enforces how pernicious and biased it is as an evaluation metric. But I completely agree. I agree with everything that's been said. Unfortunately, the LSAT is one of those artificial things which there is no substitute but practice, and particularly practice under test conditions. My method of preparation was more or less, I paid for I was able to afford the online test prep course thing that gave me the big book of every LSAT that has been assigned from 1990 to the present. I started with 1990, I went to the present. Under test conditions, once or twice a day for most of summer. And I mean, unfortunately, I suspect that my performance, insofar as it was any good, it was entirely because I was able to invest the time, energy, and money into doing enormous amounts of practice. I would say it's unfortunate that's the case. And I certainly would agree that, if you can't do preposterous amounts of practice, do what you can. And it's classically considered 1/3 of the sort of the 3 pillars of law school admissions. I don't know how much that's changed since the pandemic, to be honest. I suspect that as things have worn on, the LSAT has receded in importance. But nonetheless, it's unfortunately it's one of those things where if you can practice it a lot, the more practice you can do, I think the better is the most that can be said about the LSAT.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in and say that I regret not doing more research about different methods of preparing for the LSAT. I think it's definitely the type of test where it behooves you to do that self-reflection, find out what kind of person you are, and then also research all the different methods that are out there and test them all out, because not every person is the same. The way you learn, the time that you have, the responsibilities that you have, you need to find the right way to fit your lifestyle and like where you are in life to suit how you study for the LSAT. And I think research is a big part of it. So whether you're doing a class, tutoring, or self-study, I personally, I actually took a class, I invested in that. And that was more because I needed the hand-holding I was like telling myself I was going to study, and then I just never sat down and did it. So I literally shelled out tons of cash to make someone make me study. And I think that was necessary at the time, but where I grew the most was from self-study, actually, was from researching things like Seven Sage, LSAT Demon, and those were more than like a class or anything like that. The self-study opportunity is what helped me unlock most of like the best way for me to understand and learn and things like that. And one thing that's notable in the pandemic, I guess, since I'm the only person that's like applied or has taken the LSAT Flex in this time, is that scores have gotten like a little wonky now that everything's been shifted online. And so it's been a little bit of a wave in the admission cycle like this past year and maybe in this upcoming year as scores are, well, the LSAC will insist the scores are the same across the board, but the reality is that taking the test at home in a 3-section format has had consequences on the scoring and how like the layout of all of the top scorers, the mid scorers, and beyond has had the number of people been distributed.
And just while we're talking about the LSAT, Ariane, do you think you could give us just like a brief idea of what does a law school application look like?
Yeah, so in addition to the LSAT, like your undergrad transcript, resume, things like that, you'll also have to submit a personal statement. I think all schools now accept also a diversity statement on top of that if you want to do 2 separate ones. I think that some schools also maybe had their own kind of like personal like questions that they asked you if you wanted to answer those, like very similar to the way that college application process was as well. And yeah, and then also recommendation letters are also important. I think you need at least 2 of those. I would say that for me, even though I knew I wasn't going straight to law school, I still asked professors like before I graduated if they'd be able to provide those for me for when I was ready. And so then when I was ready to apply, I kind of like sent them the links to do all of the stuff. But I think it is important, like while you're still there and you're fresh in their minds and stuff, for them to be able to kind of like get the ball rolling on that.
Great. And we're going to switch a little bit in gears. I want to hear about Alec. Can you tell us what your first year in law school was like? And then I'd also love to hear from Ariane and Roxanne as well.
Sure. So the first year, I think, is at least programmatically the same for everyone. You do a series of required courses. The required courses are usually in a more or less lecture format, with occasional trials by fire as professors ask you difficult and inconvenient questions that boil down to guess what I'm thinking. And then you do a writing class that is somewhat smaller and that typically is more of a sort of practicum. And the subjects you do are basically the same in first year across most law schools in the country. You know, everyone will do contracts, everyone will do torts, everyone will do civil procedure, everyone will do criminal law. Many places will do property. Some schools will have an elective where you can pick between, you know, international law and corporations and sort of other things. But it's all fairly standard, and it's an interesting experience because I think most of us in undergraduate get very involved in things that aren't class and extracurriculars, and you know the job hunt starts pretty quickly. In law school, in the first year, you are really dedicated to mostly studying. And I think the closer you can get to that norm of spending most of your time studying, the better off you'll be. Especially because and this is, I've noticed I've tracked a question in the box, the discombobulation of how the hiring process has worked for both law firms and judges has meant that the first year grades are increasingly critically important. And that means, and your first year grades are going to be determined by a final summative exam that will be about 3 to 5 continuous hours where you write essays on one, you know, unhappy afternoon in midwinter or midsummer, and that's it. You know, it's, I was fortunate in that I grew up in Australia where high school ends that way. But for most folks, I think it's slightly horrifying. If you have a bad day, them's the breaks. So I think that in terms of what is the 1L experience like, if you do it right, it is studying and self-care. For me, my self-care was swimming. I would swim 4 times a week, and it was great because you can't look at or hear or see anything. It's a sensory deprivation. And it's great to do physical exercise. And I think that's so important, especially when you're intensively studying. But the rest was going to class, reading, revising, reviewing, outlining, and doing it all again. And law schools are very attentive in trying to cut away all there's no recruiting until the end of the first semester, or shouldn't be. There's no, extracurricular, very few extracurriculars. And the focus is on studying. And I think it's actually quite refreshing. And I think it's a good move. Marianne, how dated is this advice? Am I off the?
I think that's pretty accurate. Yeah. I mean, I can speak to maybe some of the more logistics about NYU specifically. At NYU, I think that the law school is maybe like maybe 450 incoming 1Ls every year. And so there you'll get broken into different sections with I think there's 5 sections, 90 people in each one. And so in there, you honestly do get really tight with those people because you're literally having class with them every single day for the whole entire year. And, like he said, you're taking the kind of core law classes like constitutional law. Actually, NYU constitutional law is not required during 1L, but other classes like civil procedure, criminal law, and things of that nature. NYU also does do the elective option for the spring. So you can kind of pick between different ones. Like I said, constitutional law, property, tax law. A lot of people really just end up doing whatever kind of law they're most interested in or think that they might be interested in. So my year I did property and things like that. I think that going back to kind of like the social aspect of it, I would say I think that you can totally still like have a life outside of things. I'm from New York originally, so like I had friends here like that I grew up with, that I went to college with, and I was still able to keep up with them as well as have my studies. And then also within the law school itself, it really is like a big community that you're a part of now. And like there's so many like undergrads, so many clubs and organizations that you can be a part of, affinity groups and things like that. So like when I was a 1L, I really got involved with our Black Law Students Association and other clubs as well. I think the one big difference between like undergraduate clubs and law school clubs is that there's way less of it's like you take on as much as you want to type of thing. So you can kind of like sign up for all these listservs and kind of get the information about the events they're having, or, like get mentorship through it and things of that nature, but you don't have to commit all of your time to it. So like Alec is saying, a huge bulk of your time will be studying and like reading for class and things like that. But you do have the opportunity to kind of like get to know people by doing all these other things as well.
And I know, Roxanne, you aren't in law school yet, but you did mention that you took a class that was similar to a law school class. So would you like to talk about that a little bit?
Well, I think all I have to really say about it is it probably was just like baby steps compared to the workload that you actually have in law school, but it was exactly what Alec had mentioned before. You're reading cases, case after case after case after case, and then Socratic seminar, like pressure mode. I think what I have to offer on this front is I listen to a lot of podcasts. I wasn't really a podcast listener before I started the application or like just the law school process in general, but I do think they're such a great resource for information. So I would highly recommend to look up like different sources to have people sort of like coach you through a lot of what to expect. And one of those things that's like popped up recently is like people talking about sort of that 0L, which is, your summer or your time before law school, and how do you prepare for the super important first year? And I think opinions differ, but I think what I've taken away from that is that law school is a very specific experience that you can somewhat prepare for maybe, but it's actually more important that you rest well, find out what your self-care strategies are, like make a plan for, maybe clearing out your schedule for the semester or for the year in preparing for that 1L experience. there's, I think, different things that you can do like on 7 Sage to like review or like somewhat prepare for what you'll be encountering in that first year. But it just seems like a lot of people say that it's just, you won't know what you're doing until you're there. So the best thing you can do is just enjoy yourself before you dive in. Take the time to rest up, build up your energy, mentally prepare yourself for a year of exponential growth and learning.
Totally agree with that. Don't try and prepare for your classes in the summer before law school. It's just sad. Read good books, watch good movies. Yeah, strongly agree with that.
That sounds great. And we actually have an audience question that ties into this. What skills do you think really help you in doing well and surviving law school? And maybe Roxanne, can you tell us a little bit about that? Or no, Roxanne is not in it yet. Ariane, we're going to jump it over to you.
Yeah, for sure. So I think you're going to hear this advice before law school and throughout while you're there. A huge part of it is really just like knowing yourself and like being able to understand like your own style of learning and like what that looks like for you, and really like try to zone out everyone else and like what they're doing. Because I think that you really get caught up with like, oh, wow, I saw so-and-so in the library like all day long, like I should be too. And it's like, whatever, like their study style or like learning style will be different from yours. And so like you really shouldn't get too concerned with that or wrapped up in it, because it just ends up kind of like psyching yourself out. I know that's easier said than done, because I literally am still struggling with it to this day. But I think that it really is like the most solid advice, just because law school is like, wherever you go, it will be like, it's just an like inherently competitive environment. Like the grading structure, like Alec mentioned before, the way that you're like on a curve and things like that. I, for one, like in my undergrad, I had never been graded like this before. So that was kind of new for me to be graded like comparatively to like my other classmates. But I do think like, depending on where you go, at least here at NYU, everyone is very like collaborative in that way. So like there are different study groups that you can join with people from your section, and like people share materials and resources and things like that. And so I think that like just knowing how you can make the best use of all of this stuff is the best way to go about it.
So I would say that for me, the most important skill to have is the skill of, how to put this the best way, the skill of knowing when you don't know something and asking for help about it. I think undergraduate in particular teaches us to perform in a way that, well, of course we know it. Oh, don't look unprepared, don't look like you don't know, maintain the facade. We often, my undergraduate, refer to the mask or the pen face. And I think in law school, you do so much better by being really candid with yourself. I mean, if you're going to perform, I'm not saying don't perform, but with yourself, say, okay, I don't get this. I think for me, it was a moment of real self-knowledge and humility when I, having had quite a high opinion of my own intelligence, to be blunt, I turned to some of this material and was like, I don't know how faintest idea of what's being said here. And the second related part of that is asking for help. And, I went to NYU as well, and NYU, the community and the students, your fellow students are such a great resource, but there's also wonderful professors who are always happy to talk to you and always delighted to be talking about their field. And so many people, I think, feel very nervous about making use of those resources and putting up their hand and asking for help. And I will say professionally, it is both when I was a more junior attorney and now as a somewhat more senior attorney, that's a skill that is fundamental in law, because everyone will always get into trouble at the moment at which they pretend they know something or pretend they've done something and they haven't done it. And it's terrible when you're a junior. It's even worse as a senior, because everyone's relying on people to be honest. And part of that is, there's a culture, I think, I speak for Kirkland, but I think in any firm, any good firm, of being very accepting and understanding of like, okay, I don't know it, we don't know it, then we're going to get smart about it. So understanding and accepting that you don't know things and asking for help, I think, are two critically important and underappreciated skills in both law school and in your legal career.
I can't really speak to this, but I do have a lot of very good friends and peers and classmates that have gone on to law school. And one thing that I've taken away from conversations with them, and I do think law school is, as Ariane mentioned before, a lot of that experience comes from talking to people that have gone. And that's how you learn about whether it's right for you. So what I've taken away from their conversations is that law school can have this really brutal reputation of being a place where your confidence will take a dive, and it's really easy for that to happen. So one thing that I've prioritized in my thought processes is, again, that self-reflection method of, can I be strong enough to get through this? Like, can I handle competition? Can I handle disappointment? Can I overcome? Can I rise above? Can I be resilient? I think those are all traits that shine through in an environment where it's competitive, but there's also this element of collaboration. And I think the humility element plays a big part in that as well, which I think Alec touched on. So just lots of friends who've talked about how their mental health has been affected while they were at law school. And I think one of the best ways to sort of combat that is just to know yourself better, and be prepared for disappointment, or being happy, learning how to be happy for others, lots of things like that. And I think that goes beyond just the first year, but also my friend just finished his recruiting season, and apparently that's been a lot of emotional ups and downs as well. And that I think is probably even scarier than the admissions process. It's like when you've already paid tons and tons of money to go to law school, and now you need to make sure that you get a job that will help you pay back, or getting that unicorn position that you bet all your dreams on. I think that's when the stakes get really, really high, and not just in the admissions process. You have to be strong for that. Like you have to fortify yourself.
And can I just jump in on one point that I think is worth making, which is in terms of asking for help, that can also include professional help. And I will say I had significant difficulties with depression throughout law school. And thank goodness for NYU's fabulous mental health resources, which my NYU insurance covered 100% of, with a microscopic copay, talking $2 or something like that, and had fabulous connections to get me all of the experts I needed very quickly, and provide all of those resources there. It's always, and I know it's true of any law school or almost every law school, the insurance covers it. It is, and it can be a surprisingly important and helpful method, support for people going through law school. And there's a lot of people who go through it because, it's not natural to spend 3 years being yelled at about highly technical subjects under high pressure conditions. And so I would really encourage folks to make use of those resources. There's certainly no impact on the bar, not anymore, in using those resources. I fully disclosed my mental illnesses when I applied for the bar. I got no questions. The only question I got in my bar character and fitness was about Kylie Minogue. I answered it incorrectly. I still got in to be a member of the bar. So that would be another thing is that, there are more help than just professors, and you should really avail yourself of it, and don't feel at all ashamed that you are. All you're doing is you're taking care of your health, and that's the most important thing you can do.
Okay, so something that you guys kind of have been talking about is networking. So we have a question from the audience. Could you talk about the networking aspect that you mentioned and how to go about it successfully to benefit from the law school process?
Yeah, so some of the networking that I did, at least before going to law school, was, like I said, reaching out to alumni at my undergrad university who had already gone to law school. And then also when I worked at my firm, reaching out to attorneys there and kind of getting their perspectives as well. I really think that networking is like, people it's like this word that feels daunting and it's like hard to do or things like that. but it's really just like a matter of like having a conversation with people and just like being able to kind of like share your interests and then understand their interests as well, their paths. I mean, if anyone wants to reach out to me, I'd be happy to share like an intro email where it's like you're just cold reaching out to people and just talking to them, being like, I would love to hear about your path like in the legal field. And it's really, people are so happy to talk about it, especially lawyers. Like, we like to talk about ourselves. Like, so I think that it's really not hard to get people going as soon as you get started. Even like Christina here, like we just met 2 seconds ago and we were talking about New York and things like that. So I think it's really like, don't make it into like more of a daunting thing than it has to be. Like, just be yourself and have conversations and people will be willing to talk to you.
Totally agree. Nothing to add.
Great. We have another question from the audience, which is, what do you think makes your application stand out? And what are things that applicants should consider emphasizing or highlighting?
So I actually just recently for NYU was helping with like, we have like a 3L reader program where 3Ls end up like helping them with some applications that they're looking through. And for me, like reading through them, I think that something to really keep in mind is just to like be your true authentic self in them. Like, yes, you obviously want to highlight the amazing things that you've done. But I do think that kind of like steering clear of just like reiterating your resume when you're writing your personal statement is something like the best advice that I got, because I think that obviously like they'll be able to see the things that you've done, but they want to know why you did them and they want to know what you've learned from them and how you've grown from them. And so I think that like just really being able to be vulnerable in that kind of space, I think is tough. Honestly, it was for me, but I think once you get over that initial part of it, it really does make you make your application much stronger. Because I mean, a lot of law schools, I mean, I think now actually some law schools do some like interviews and like things of that nature. Like it's kind of like a virtual thing where like they'll ask you a question and you're literally like responding to it, to like you're videotaping yourself responding. So it's not like real in that way. But I do think that your application kind of stands alone more so than in any other sense. So just being able to really like reflect on who you are and show them who you are is the best thing that you could do.
I completely agree with that. I think classically the sort of application has 3 pillars: the LSAT, the GPA, and everything else. I have a suspicion that everything else is becoming a much bigger and more important piece of this puzzle. But to respond maybe to another one of the questions that came up, what's the best thing you can do early in college? Is to do the opposite of what I did and take your freshman classes seriously and get good grades. It's always a great idea to get great grades in undergraduate. I think it has many applications, but law school is certainly one of them. In terms of the larger application, I think one thing is that a lot of folks, I was certainly in this category, overemphasize particularly the LSAT piece of it, because that seems something that's sort of objective and achievable. And I think spending some time reflecting about it and then asking folks and thinking more deeply about your personal statement, particularly about giving your recommenders plenty of runway to write, but investing a little bit of time in those pieces of the puzzle, I think is very helpful. And I also think, and this is just going off anecdote, that it's really helpful to explain why you want to go to law school. It's surprising, and I think part of it is we're so used to writing college application essays where it's something very fuzzy about college, because you never, especially the sort of fancy liberal arts colleges, because you're never sure where they're going to. Law school, you're going to be a lawyer, at least initially. Later on, sure, things diverge, but the vast majority of law school graduates go on to become lawyers or want to become lawyers. And so explaining why you want to be a lawyer and the law school specifically, I think can be a very helpful and a surprisingly, I think, underappreciated part of the application.
I mentioned podcasts before, and one that I think has been really helpful is from Spivey Consulting, which is a pretty famous law school admissions consulting firm out there. And then they do a podcast with some nice sound bites of information. And one thing that they always emphasize is the differentiation piece, which is going out there and making sure that you have like your personal narrative that ties in with your experiences, why you want to go to law school, and making sure that you communicate that really effectively and clearly in order to, make yourself stand out in that sort of way. And I think that that is a very malleable piece. Like how you differentiate yourself can be in a myriad of different ways. But I think that sort of buzzword is helpful when thinking about like how do your personal statements, your resumes, the opportunities you pursue all come together in such a way that really reflects who you are and the type of lawyer that you aspire to be. And then I think the other thing that is important, what was I going to say? Never mind, it'll come back to me later.
I also wanted to say, in terms of like grades and stuff, like Alex said, totally important, but I also wouldn't get super hung up on them. If like, for example, like me, I realized I wanted to go to law school in like my junior year of college. And at that point, like my grades were what they were. And so it was one of those things where it was like, how else can I like work on kind of like improving my image and like what my package, like Roxanne was saying, looks like. And I think that you can also do that by kind of like taking up leadership positions in different organizations, or like if you're volunteering, things of that nature. Like those things are not discredited. Like law schools do look at that in terms of just like who you are and what you're passionate about and things of that nature. So I really think that like you shouldn't get super like discouraged from applying or like anything like that if your GPA is not what you think it needs to be. Like even if you go on these websites and they're like, oh, XYZ school only accepts 3.5 and above, like I can't apply there. Like, no, you should definitely still apply. Those things, the numbers are not everything. And I think that, like Alex said, they're weighing those, like the other stuff, like the personal statement, the diversity statement, things of that nature, a lot more than they used to, especially now. And so like you can really kind of show who you are without just being super caught up with numbers.
I remembered my last point, Ariane jogged my mind for me. And it is that it's important to keep in mind that law school is professional school, like you are applying for a profession. And I think that that's really highly valued in the application process, to be able to show that you are a professional, that you're someone who's mature, that has great critical thinking skills, that can carry yourself in this very, traditional, conservative in many ways environment, and that you're someone that's going to be, lawyers need to be reliable, responsible people. And I think that that's something that's important to keep in mind as you're choosing your topics, as you're finding ways to present yourself, as you're selecting, the different ways that you're going to show that you are ready for professional school.
Okay, we have a couple people in the audience who are interested in financial aid and how to deal with financing law school. If you guys wanted to talk about that a little bit.
Sure. So I think that this is a bit reductive, but I think you can really summarize it as there are three principal ways that you finance law school. The first is debt that you directly pay off with your salary. The second is debt that you pay off through a public service loan forgiveness program. And the third is scholarships. Assuming you can't, you're not in the 0.01% that could just pay the whole tuition, out of your own pocket. So going through each of those categories, I want to begin with the third one, which is actually this is the first one, which is the law school has become so obscenely expensive that most folks who are going to find themselves in a position to be able to pay off the debt on a sort of standard 10-year basis are going to need to go into big law. If you want to go into big law, I'm sorry to say, you're either going to need absolutely superb grades for any school, or you're going to need to go to a very highly ranked law school. Ranking, I regret, is extremely important in many elements of the legal profession. Law is a deeply hierarchical creature. And so I think it's important to emphasize that if that's your sort of proposed vector, and if you want to go into big law, goodness knows Kirkland, I'm not speaking, of course, officially for Kirkland, but I can say as an observational matter, hires plenty of people from plenty of law schools. But at the same time, it is nonetheless the case that big law recruits overwhelmingly from the top 16 law schools and really from the top 10 law schools. And you should pay careful attention to that. Likewise, on public service loan forgiveness, there is a government sort of peak program that does this. But many law schools have their own public service loan forgiveness programs. They are all extremely complicated and they all vary in their technical details. And so if you have an interest in going into public interest law, where what will happen is if you go that route and you do something like being a public defender, you do it for 10 years, your whole debt is paid off. Exactly how that works and what you pay in the interim and all those kinds of questions vary from school to school to school. And I would say after you get your offers, apply everywhere. After you get your offers, it behooves you to take a very careful look at how those programs work so that you can figure out what the best option is for you. And then merit A, which is a final piece, I would only say beware of false economies, which is that often, because law schools understand how critical the rankings are, often a school with lower rankings will award merit scholarships. But if you take that money, you will end up with more debt that would be more difficult to pay because your access to higher paying jobs may be lower because of the ranking of that school. So I would say that, that said, if you are doing it what I'm doing, the conventional route of paying it off through working in big law, you can have income-based repayment in many, many jobs where you pay a relatively low amount per month based entirely on your income, and it doesn't take more than a certain percentage of your income. So it's really possible. When I was clerking for the government, I was earning much less than I earned in big law, but I was paying very reasonable sums because the income-based repayment structures offered by the federal government allow you to make your debt very manageable. So this is an area where you need to do a lot of research and figure out your own resources and your own career paths. And I think this is an area where more time spent is going to really reward you, especially when you're coming to weigh up the differences between your offers. Sorry, that was a long lecture, but hopefully useful.
Yeah, I totally agree with Alec. I think also when you do end up getting your financial aid packages from law schools, one thing that I didn't realize when I was doing the process was that people really do kind of like try to negotiate as much as they can with schools. So like you can send your offers from other schools, like presumably like they're kind of like similar ranked schools, and those are the ones that other schools will take more seriously. But if you do get a lot of money from a school that's similarly ranked from another one, you can send that, and hopefully they can kind of like adjust your package accordingly based on like how much they really want you to come to that school. So that's something that I know a lot of people have had success with. Also, I think that so even like before you go to law school, some programs will have scholarships that you can apply for during the application process, which is also something I regret not doing or like looking into as much. So those are opportunities as well. But if you don't end up getting one of those, it's not like an end all be all type of situation. When you are in law school, there also are a bunch of different scholarship opportunities that also present themselves. So like once you're at 1L, there's new ones, 2L even as well. So I think that there are a lot of different ways to kind of like still be trying while you're in law school to get this kind of financial help.
One thing that I'll just, from research and from what people have told me to note about financial aid is also that some schools that offer you scholarships offer them conditionally, and for a lot of people that can actually backfire. Like if they offer you a lot of money, but the condition is that you need to remain in, the whatever top % of your class, and, God forbid something happens and your scholarship is on the line. Apparently that's a lot of horror stories that do happen. So it's just making sure that as you're also going through that scholarship negotiation process, you're looking at like what strings are attached, like what does it mean to accept this money, and you want to do your best to negotiate for aid that is coming regardless of your performance or any factors.
Great. And another question that we have is for all the panelists, based on where you are now, what is one thing you know now that you wish you knew when you were in our position, college position?
It was said before, but honestly, I wish I had just powered through undergrad with the best grades. I wish I hadn't spent my senior spring like a senior spring. I do think that, those 3 pillars that we've been talking about are all important. But something like GPA, it's like, once it's done, it's done. And you can try to make up for it in other ways, but I think it's a really nice feeling after you've known that you've done your best all the way through. And that is definitely an advantage for people that are attending this webinar and like sort of know they want to go to law school ahead of time, because it means that, you have your eyes on the prize. So just, yeah, keep your eyes on the prize. Don't don't take your foot off the pedal, keep your grades up, and it will make sure that all of your doors stay open.
I think that I wish that I knew that there are just like so many avenues that people kind of take before going to law school. So like, for example, like in terms of like major things like that, like not they're at law school, people are all types of majors. Like they're science majors, they're people who come from like the humanities backgrounds, like all the whole 9 yards. And then also in terms of like if you do work beforehand, people literally have like the whole gambit of jobs like beforehand to do. So like I worked at a law firm and like I maybe could have done that for 1 year to figure out if I wanted to go to law school and then done something else after that. And that's something that I think that like I just didn't realize that like you don't actually need to have like prior legal experience in order to go to law school. Like that is not a requirement. They do not expect that of you. They know that like people come to law school, I think because of like the way of thinking, like law school, it's like lawyers are problem solvers at the end of the day. And like that's a huge part of what they're doing. And so like people come to kind of learn how to do that better and like critically think about things. And so you can really do that from any background, no matter what it is. So I mean, I really wouldn't, I think it's just like I put a lot of pressure on myself to try to like make it seem like I wanted to go to law school since I was like a baby, when that's just not true. And I don't think that you have to really like put that pressure on yourself.
Yeah, I think, most of my regrets come down to bad subject choices, both in undergraduate and in law school. I think the one thing I wish I had been more, I had really known is that I could and should be true to myself and what I am interested in and what I care about, even if it isn't necessarily the fancy thing to do. I ended up having, in some ways, very conventional, goodness knows, NYU has a lot of people in big law, but in other ways, very unconventional sort of career path in that, like, for example, clerk for a state Supreme Court judge, which is very unusual. Most folks clerk federally. I ended up clerking in Connecticut, having never set foot in that state in my life until my clerkship interview. And those were wonderful sort of experiences. And I think that I regret a little bit that there were some wonderful experiences in law school I didn't take advantage of because I said to myself, oh, it'd be better, or it would enable more fancy things down the line if I did something instead of something else. Law school is its own intrinsically wonderful experience, and I think you should enjoy it for its own sake. You'll never have it again. And let the sort of future consequences of that play out, because usually they'll be better because you do better in classes and doing activities that you actually enjoy.
This will probably be our last question for today, but we have a couple people in the Q&A box asking how you guys chose which law schools to apply to and why you chose NYU Law.
Yeah, so I can talk about that a bit. I personally applied to, so I went to Wesleyan for undergrad, which was like the whole like green grass and like all of that cuteness. So I think that when I was first applying to law school, I thought that I wanted to go back to that kind of environment. So I did apply to a lot of schools that like weren't in cities. And then after I'd worked in New York again and been back here in the city, I realized that I did want to end up being here. And I think that NYU in particular, they have a lot of clinical programming, which is kind of like, basically you get like practical experience while you're in law school. And I think that like being in New York ended up being a huge factor of why I came, because it was like, there's so many opportunities here, so many organizations that are here. Like you can work for like the SDNY, the EDNY, and do these programs that like at other schools, it's a lot more difficult for them to do. And so I think that that's like a huge reason as well, just like being in the city and being where all the action is happening ended up really being great for me. I'll also say, I think that like once you do end up getting into law schools, it's like, it's about the fit at the end of the day. Like I think a lot of people act like it's not like college in the sense where like you have to feel it or things like that. But I do think that some of it does come from that, because you are spending 3 years there and you're with these people, and you want to make sure that these are people that you can actually see yourself like thriving with and like being able to get everything done. And so like when I came to visit, I really felt like the community itself was super supportive, and like they had a very great like Black Law Students Association, like a lot of support from that angle as well, which I think is really important. If it's important to you, it's something that you should definitely make sure is available. So yeah, I think that like those are all factors that went into kind of like where I wanted to apply to, and then also like where I ended up going.
I think for me, a somewhat similar position. You know, I'm gay, and so there are certain veto points of certain institutions that do not expressly do not cater to my particular population. But once you go past those veto points, I think for me, a big piece of the puzzle was rankings. And I think I've just touched on this theme before. Look, there's no real big difference. US News likes to shuffle this deck every year. There's no real big difference between like 4 and 5 or 5 and 6, he says, going to the law school that was ranked number 6. But there is a big difference between, 2 and 12. I think once you get to about 10 ranking slots apart or thereabouts, then I think there's a big difference. And it's unfortunate that the law schools are stratified like that. But I would say, for me, ranking was a huge consideration. And then once I had sort of gotten in, my decision and narrowed my decision to the highest ranked schools that were comparable to each other, within 3 or 4 ranks of each other. Then it came down to one was sort of the intellectual offerings of the school. I mean, architecturally, all law schools are the same, right? There's desks and chairs and this is sort of, hidebound books. But the intellectual strengths of the school vary. NYU, for example, at the time I was very interested in comparative constitutionalism. NYU had fabulous comparative constitutionalism faculty. So what faculty are teaching in what areas? Every school has different strengths in these, and that matters. And then, yeah, I completely agree, Ariane. It was a lot about the culture of the place, and particularly, I think NYU really came out over the top because of how warm and supportive and how much of a community that I felt it was, and it really fit my personality. So I would say, 1 was rankings, and 2 intellectual sort of community, and then 3 that sort of peer community were the 3 big things.
Really quickly, I agree.
Oh, and I'm so terribly sorry. I have to jump immediately at this point, but thank you all very much, and I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, you're good. I just want to put out there, I think money is a really big factor in my personal pursuit, and then for other people. And then one thing to sort of, you can research online, go on Reddit with caution, but there's like this T14 mentality, and then there's like that T20. And I think that sort of information is helpful for you to think about, like research conversations and what people say. And I think money and prestige are big parts of that conversation, and that will help you figure out like what are your main considerations when making your choices. Is it prestige? Is it ranking? Is it money? Location? Research what other people have said and all the conversations that are out there, and that will be helpful.
Ariane, Roxanne, and Alec, who just left, thank you all so much for joining us today. This is only the first part in a 6-part series, so we hope that you now have a better sense of, do you want to go to law school? What do you want to do post-college? And we are sorry if we weren't able to get to your question, but there will be more career-focused talks in the future. So have a great rest of your day, and thank you so much for joining us.
Course. And honestly, like, I think you guys have our emails, but feel free to email me if you have any other questions. I just responded to a question saying that as well. Thanks for having me.